My name is Reyna Castillo, and I want to tell you about the day I stopped being the kind of woman who lets things go. It was a Thursday in March, the kind of cold, gray Thursday that has no personality, no ambition, the calendar equivalent of a shrug. I was sitting in the all-hands meeting that our CEO, Douglas Hart, insisted on holding every quarter in the largest conference room on the 14th floor. He called it alignment. We called it theater. Douglas was a tall man who had mastered the art of seeming more intelligent than he was. He had sandy hair that he wore slightly too long for his age, a collection of blazers that all looked the same but apparently cost a fortune, and a habit of tilting his head when he listened to you that gave the impression of deep consideration while his eyes told a different story entirely. He had been brought in 18 months ago by the board, and in those 18 months he had reorganized the company twice, rebranded the product once, and taken credit for a revenue milestone that my team had spent 14 months building toward. That milestone was the reason I was sitting in this meeting. That milestone was also the reason I was owed a bonus that had quietly, carefully, deliberately never arrived. I want to give you some context because context matters. I am not someone who chases money for its own sake. I grew up watching my mother work double shifts at a hotel in Sacramento, coming home smelling like industrial cleaner and someone else's room service. She put me through school on tips and overtime, and she told me once, just once, the way she said important things, that the world will take exactly as much from you as you allow it to. I became a finance director at 34. I built a team of 8 people who were sharp and loyal and quietly underpaid in the way that most good people in mid-level corporate roles are underpaid. I was good at my job the way some people are good at chess. Not because it was glamorous, but because I understood the underlying logic of it, the way numbers told stories, the way a balance sheet could hold secrets the way a face could. The bonus in question was $47,000. I know how that sounds. I know some people reading this would need to work for a year to see that number. I am not unaware of my privilege in even having that conversation. But I want to be clear about something. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that the bonus had been promised, put in writing, tied to a specific performance target, and that performance target had been hit, exceeded, actually, by 11%. It was the fact that when I asked about it, I was told, with practiced corporate vagueness, that there had been recalibration of the incentive structure and that individual payouts were being reviewed in the context of overall company performance. It was the fact that I smiled and nodded and said, "Of course, I understand," and then went back to my desk and sat very still for a long moment, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in years. But I'll get back to that. The all-hands meeting began the way they always did. A video. Douglas loved videos. This one was a slick 2-minute montage of the company's journey over the past year, set to music that sounded like it had been composed specifically to make you feel like you were in a pharmaceutical commercial. Shots of the office. Shots of smiling employees. A graph, my graph, one I had presented to the board in October, showing the revenue curve bending sharply upward. Douglas took the stage to applause that was enthusiastic enough to be polite and no more. He talked about vision. He talked about resilience. He talked about the team, using the word "we" so promiscuously that it began to lose all meaning. And then, and this is the part one want you to hold on to, he said something that made the back of my neck go very still. He said, "And I want to give a special shout out to our finance team, who really knocked it out of the park this year. Because of that performance, I'm pleased to announce that leadership is receiving performance bonuses this quarter." Applause. He smiled. "We earned it," he said. I did not applaud. I want to tell you exactly what it felt like to hear that. It felt like biting into something and finding it hollow. It felt like the specific nausea of being gaslit in public, in front of 80 people, most of whom had no idea what was happening, and a few of whom did, and were watching me very carefully from the corners of their eyes. Leadership was receiving performance bonuses. Leadership, which, in Douglas's organizational chart, was defined as the C-suite and 2 layers of VPs, a group that did not include me, despite the fact that I had presented directly to the board, signed off on the financial strategy, and was the one who had actually run the numbers that made that revenue curve possible. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and I smiled the smile I had perfected over 10 years of being a woman in rooms where the credit flowed upward and the blame flowed down. And I thought, okay, I should tell you about Marcus, because Marcus is important to this story. Marcus Webb was our CFO. He was also, in theory, my direct supervisor, though in practice our relationship was more collaborative than hierarchical, or so I had always believed. Marcus was a pragmatist. He wore the same brand of loafers in 3 different colors and ate the same salad for lunch every day and genuinely believed that if everyone just stayed calm and reasonable, things would work out. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who had never been in a situation where calm and reasonable didn't work, which had left him constitutionally unprepared for the ones where it didn't. I had brought the bonus question to Marcus in January. He had been uncomfortable. He'd done the head tilt thing, he'd learned it from Douglas, and said something about the board wanting to review compensation structures before finalizing payouts. He'd said my bonus hadn't been denied, just deferred. He'd said these things and then looked at his salad with the expression of a man who very much wished he were somewhere else. I'd asked him to put that in writing. He'd said he'd follow up. He never followed up. After the all-hands, I went back to my office. I had a real office with a door that closed, which I'd negotiated specifically because I'd learned years ago that privacy was a form of power, and I sat down and I opened the drawer in my desk where I kept the things I didn't want to think about too often. There was an email from 9 months ago, from Marcus, on behalf of Douglas, outlining the bonus structure tied to the Q3 revenue milestone. Specific numbers, specific thresholds, my name, my target, my percentage. $47,000 upon achievement of 95% of target. We had hit 106%. I read the email twice. Then I opened a new document, and I started to write. Here's the thing about being a finance director that nobody really understands from the outside. You see everything. Not because you're snooping, but because the money flows through you. Every expense report, every reimbursement, every vendor contract, every departmental budget, it all passes through my team's hands at some point. We are the nervous system of a company's financial body. We feel everything. Over the 18 months of Douglas's tenure, I had felt some things that had made me quietly uneasy. Things I had filed away without quite examining them. Expenses that were categorized in ways that seemed slightly off. Vendor relationships that had appeared shortly after Douglas arrived and billed in ways that were hard to trace. A consulting contract for a firm I'd never heard of, approved directly by the board at Douglas's recommendation, that had produced no visible output. I had noted these things the way you note a strange sound in your house at night, with a sort of low-level alertness that never quite becomes alarm. I started going back through those files. I am not going to tell you that what I found was obvious or dramatic. The reality of financial misconduct, when it exists, is usually neither. It is tedious and technical, and lives in the gap between what something appears to be and what it actually is. It lives in the details that most people don't have the patience or the training to examine. I had both the patience and the training. What I found, over the course of about 3 weeks of very careful, very quiet, very thorough review, done after hours, backed up on a personal drive, documented in a format that a forensic accountant could follow, was a pattern. Not a smoking gun. A pattern. Expenses that had been authorized by Douglas personally, outside the normal approval process, totaling just under the threshold that would have triggered mandatory dual authorization. Payments to that consulting firm, Meridian Strategic Partners, LLC, incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, which was to say, around the time Douglas had started, that did not align with any deliverable I could identify. A series of executive travel reimbursements that included dates and locations that overlapped with a real estate conference I happened to know Douglas attended annually in his personal capacity, not his professional one. Individually, any one of these things had an innocent explanation. Together, they told a story. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this part matters. There was a moment, sitting in my car in the parking garage at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, laptop open on the passenger seat, when I asked myself what I was doing. Not in a frightened way. In a clear-eyed way. I was going to make an enemy of a CEO. I was going to put my job, possibly my career, certainly my comfort, on the line. I was going to do this for $47,000 that I was owed but could, technically, survive without. I was going to do this in a corporate culture that had a long, proud tradition of punishing the person who raised the flag more thoroughly than the person who flew it. And I thought about my mother. The world will take exactly as much from you as you allow it to. I thought about the 80 people in that conference room. I thought about the people on my team who were good at their jobs and worked hard and would probably never see the kind of money Douglas was funneling through Delaware shell companies. I thought about the next woman who would sit in my chair and be told her bonus was being reviewed. I thought about the way Douglas had said we earned it and smiled. I closed the laptop. I started the car. I drove home. And then the next morning I called an attorney. Her name was Priya Anand, and she had been recommended to me by a woman I'd gone to grad school with who described her as the kind of lawyer who makes grown men cry and then charges them for the tissues. She was 40, compact, precise, and she listened to me for 45 minutes without interrupting, which I had not experienced from anyone in a professional context in recent memory. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The bonus," she said, "is a breach of contract case. That's relatively clean. The other material," she meant my documentation, "is potentially much larger. But I want to be clear with you about what larger means in practice. It means risk. It means scrutiny. It means your name attached to a process that will not be comfortable." "I know," I said. "You've worked there 7 years," she said. "You have a team, relationships, a reputation in the industry." "I know," I said again. She looked at me. "All right. Then let's talk about how to do this correctly." What we decided, and by we I mean Priya mostly and me listening carefully and asking the right questions, was this: we would not go straight to litigation. That would be slow, expensive, and would give Douglas time to move things around. Instead, we would use a mechanism that exists in most publicly facing companies and is frequently underutilized by exactly the people who should be using it most. We would file an anonymous whistleblower complaint with the company's audit committee. Every company of our size was required by its board charter to have an audit committee, typically 3 independent directors, whose job was, in theory, to provide oversight of financial reporting and controls. Most of the time, this committee was a formality, a rubber stamp, a box that got checked in the annual proxy statement. But they had real power, when invoked correctly. Priya drafted the complaint. I provided the documentation. We were meticulous. We were boring on purpose. Financial misconduct cases that succeed are the ones that don't look like grudges, that look like accounting problems, because accounting problems are much harder to dismiss. We submitted it on a Friday afternoon, formatted and footnoted, to the 3 independent directors on the audit committee, their personal email addresses, which are, in fact, public record for board members of incorporated entities, a fact that seemed to genuinely surprise people when I mentioned it, and the company's external auditors. Then I went home and made pasta and watched a documentary about deep-sea fish and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The call came on a Monday. Not from Douglas. Not from Marcus. From a woman named Susan Ellerly, who introduced herself as the chair of the audit committee and the lead independent director, and who had a voice like someone who had been in boardrooms for 30 years and had heard every variety of corporate nonsense and was done being surprised by it. She asked if I would be willing to speak with the committee and their counsel in a confidential capacity. I said yes. She asked if I had legal representation. I said yes. There was a pause, and I heard something in it that I chose to interpret as respect, though I may have been projecting. "We'll be in touch this week," she said. "I won't walk you through every detail of what came next because some of it is still under NDA, and some of it is frankly too technical to be interesting to anyone who isn't a forensic accountant. But I will tell you the shape of it. The audit committee engaged an independent forensic accounting firm. This was not optional once the complaint was filed. Their fiduciary duty required it. The forensic accountants came in quietly, the way these things work, embedded with the regular audit process, so as not to raise immediate flags. They found what I had found, and then they found more. Meridian Strategic Partners, LLC was, it turned out, partially owned by a trust connected to Douglas's brother-in-law. The consulting fees paid to Meridian over 18 months totaled $340,000. The travel reimbursements, when examined fully, included approximately $28,000 in personal expenses that had been submitted under business categories. Total, approximately $368,000. That is not an enormous number in the context of corporate fraud. It is not Enron. It is not the kind of thing that makes national headlines. But it was real, it was documented, and it was sufficient. Douglas was put on administrative leave 11 weeks after I submitted the complaint. He resigned to pursue other opportunities per the press release 3 weeks after that. The company reached a settlement with him that included repayment provisions I was not privy to and clawback mechanisms that the new interim CEO, who was Susan Ellerly herself on an interim basis, described in her first all-hands as appropriate to the circumstances. My bonus was paid in full, with interest plus legal fees, as part of a separate settlement of my breach of contract claim. This took 4 months from initial filing. I did not get an apology from Douglas. I did not expect one. People like Douglas don't apologize, they reframe. He probably told himself, and still tells himself, that he was a victim of ambitious subordinates and an overzealous audit process. I have no way of knowing this for certain and no particular interest in finding out. Marcus still works there. He was not implicated in any misconduct. There was none, as far as I know. He is more careful now, more transparent. He follows up on things. I think the experience frightened him, and I think that fear has made him better at his job in the small ways that matter. We have a cordial professional relationship. I still work there, too. This is the part that surprises people. They expect the ending where the whistleblower rides off into the sunset, vindicated and free. But the truth is I like my job. I like my team. I like the work. And I had done nothing wrong, which meant I had nothing to run from. The new CEO, not Susan, she only stayed 6 months. They brought in someone from outside, a woman named Diana Cho, who had built a payments company from nothing and sold it twice, and had absolutely zero tolerance for vague expense categories, reorganized the leadership structure in her first 60 days. My title changed. My reporting line changed. My compensation was adjusted to reflect, in Diana's words, what this role has actually been worth for the past several years. I didn't ask for that last part. She offered it. I've thought a lot about what this story is really about. It would be easy to make it a story about a villain getting his comeuppance, and it is that, partly. But I think the more honest version is a story about permission. For a long time, I gave people permission to take from me. Not because I was weak, I want to be clear about that, but because I had been trained, the way most women in professional environments have been trained, to calculate the cost of resistance and find it too high. To absorb unfairness quietly because the alternatives seemed worse. To file things away rather than act on them. What changed that Thursday in March was not that the injustice was new. Injustice had been accumulating for a while. What changed was that Douglas bragged about it. In public. In front of 80 people, while the graph I had made played on the screen behind his head. And something in me, something I think my mother put there a long time ago, decided that the accounting was done. I am not going to tell you that this works out for everyone. I know that it doesn't. I know that there are women who did exactly what I did and lost everything, who found that the system that was supposed to protect them ground them up instead. I know that I had advantages, financial stability, a skilled attorney, documentation that was airtight, and the specific luck of an audit committee that took its responsibilities seriously. I know that I am telling you the version of this story, where it worked. But I also believe, and I am aware this might sound naive, though I assure you it is not, that the first step in any of those variables working in your favor is deciding, clearly and without drama, that you are not going to allow the world to take this particular thing from you. That you are going to do the work. That you're going to document everything. That you're going to find the right people and ask the right questions. That you're going to sit in a parking garage at 10 p.m. with a laptop on the passenger seat and look clearly at what you've found and decide that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. $47,000 was what they owed me. $368,000 was what they owed everyone else. I collected both. The pasta that Friday night was very good, by the way.
Cacio e pepe.
Simple. I've made it 100 times and it still occasionally breaks, the cheese seizing instead of emulsifying, the whole thing going grainy and wrong. You have to keep the heat low. You have to have patience. You have to trust the process even when it looks like it's not going to come together. It always comes together.